I'm Dave Dollarhide, and I joined the Navy out of college, Mississippi State, 1964, and I went to Pensacola on the AOC program. Had a brand new baby blue Pontiac convertible, and I drove up to NS Pensacola, got to the gate guard, and I told him who I was and where I was going to go, and he directed me over to Building 633 in the pre-flight area. So I was in class 2864. Our class started together and went through all that push-up stuff and military PT, and I fared pretty well. Popped out the far end of flight training in the F-11 and got my wings at Beeville, and then my orders were to the VA-44 at Cecil. So I went through the A4 RAG there, and that was in the summer of '66. It took about 2 years, almost 2 years, to get through flight training because of the Vietnam buildup at the time. And so, but I wound up in 2864, and I still in touch with a lot of those guys. I loved every bit of it, and I especially loved the F-11 because of all the airplanes I got to fly an airplane. It was very historic. It was a short-lived fighter. It was a real event in the history of naval aviation, and I was proud to be able to fly it, the first supersonic jet fighter for the Navy. I finished VA-44 and was assigned to VA-46, which had just come back from a med cruise. And so we joined them, myself and Ron Boyle, who was a lieutenant commander, Gary Stark, a lieutenant commander, and Jack O'Hara. Loved Jack O'Hara, loved all three of those guys. I was a JG with these heavies here, if you will. And I want to talk about Gary a little bit because he was a very special person in my life. Gary was like my best friend, but a father figure for me because there was a huge difference in age. He's a very senior guy, a lieutenant commander, and he was the OPSO, so he was a senior lieutenant commander. And he said, well, before we got to 46, he says, "You're going to be my wingman." I said, "Great." And we became a training partner together in preparing for what would come quite a bit later in that year, a trip to Westpac on the Forrestal. And flying on Gary's wing during all those workups, I remember in the Caribbean, one night I joined up on Gary, and it was black, dark, and I found him in the dark. The problem with Gary Stark was his throttle was a toggle switch. It was either on or off. And he was shaky Jake on his stick. So he was hard to fly on. It didn't bother me. I was not mad about any of that. I was just glad to be there and doing that with Gary. But one night we were doing so, and he's shaking and jaking and doing all that. And I said to him, because it was black, overcast, you couldn't see anything except his lights and all that. I said, "Gary, you got an autopilot problem?" And he said, "No, just looking at a chart." And that's how we flew. I mean, we'd go, I remember we were down at Culebra running strikes in there on one of the workup cruises. And Gary was leading us, I think it was two other wingmen, and we were going into Culebra target to drop some bombs. And when Gary would see us, whenever he got anywhere close to where he realized that maybe we could see him, I mean, he's still a speck, he would turn the other way and say, "I got the lead." Only he said it, "I got the lead." He was quite a guy. He's already called in on the first run-in and we were still not joined up, and we had full throttle trying to get there. I dwell on Gary because you know, we were wingmen and all that relationship as we got on the Forrestal and deployed to Westpac. We stopped in QB like every ship to do our thing going into the combat zone. And I remember they sent me out to a lone rock outside Subic Bay, maybe 20 miles out, with a Mark IV gun pod. And it was great fun. Well, that was all in the A4, and we went through the Forrestal fire. which happened on July 29th, 1967. At 10:01 in the morning, some reported it's 10:02, but who's counting? It was just a god-awful travesty, this whole experience. I was in my cockpit. I had finished my post-flight checks, and the plane captain had taken the ladder down half the chains, and he was gone. So I'm by myself at idle and waiting on the next thing. To my left, on the port side, just by the LSO platform, was Crash Dameworth from VA 106. All of a sudden, while he's looking back my way, and I heard a real heavy whump sound. His eyes got real big, and I looked to my right quickly, and there was fire on the flight deck coming up under my right wing, and surrounding John McCain's airplane to the next airplane to my right. It was a classic adrenaline flush. So you're not doing things gracefully, you're just trying to escape. By the time I got out of the cockpit and unstrapped things, I just leapt out of the left side. I didn't try the right side. I think John went out the right side because he was surrounded, and that was the shortest direction to get to clear of the fire, and he did. He got out on the probe and jumped clear. And I leapt out of the left side of my airplane very ungracefully and hit the deck like a bag of sand, broke my hip and broke my arm. And so I remember our maintenance chief, McCann, came over and he helped me stand up and move a few feet. But then things were happening and everybody's jumping and moving because the scenario around us with the fire and the potential of what was next was inevitable, and everybody was moving in that way. So I got that. By that time, I'm on my feet, and I started out towards the middle of the flight deck, and I'm right by the LSO platform. And so I got out in the middle of the deck, and there was a green shirt there. He put his arms out to me, and I lunged for him, and the weight of my little small body and probably the impact at which I grabbed him put us both down on the flight deck. So we were both laying on the flight deck for a few moments, and I remember glancing back towards the airplanes aft of us, and the fireball was engulfed every airplane. On the right side of McCain was another pilot from our squadron. To the right of McCain was Fred White. He was our number 3 in our flight of 4, and past him was Gary, who was number 1 in our flight. I was his wingman, and Denny Barton, the 4th, was over on the round with his tail pointing over the round down, and there were 3 A4s and a little V package there, and he was started. The last guy in that row from us was Herb Hope, who was the CAG ops. He was in a VA-46 jet, but he's flying with McCain, and the rest of us were in a flight of 4. We're all in the same strike, just different elements, going out for a alpha strike. As I'm seeing this, and this all happened very quickly, and all of a sudden, the first bomb goes off. Mostly high order, I can say. Some experts tell me that it wouldn't necessarily have been high order the way they went off. But as far as we were concerned, it was blowing everything around and off the flight deck and killing a lot of people and maiming people. So high order as far as I was concerned. It scooted me up the non-skid deck maybe a 1.5 feet, just the shock wave. I don't remember a noise, I just remember the shock wave. You would think that the noise of the bomb going off would be an ear problem, but that was not the case. I opened my eyes and the sky was filled with debris. And my first thought was, this is going to fall on us. And I started to get up. And the green shirt, whose name was Joe Patane, said, let's stay down. I said, no, I'm getting the hell out of here. And so I stood up, and because of my broken hip and all, I was doing a hop, skip, and a jump up towards the island. After the island was some Vidgies, and there was a Phantom up there. And then when I called under that, one of the guys hiding behind the island pulled me out and helped me over to the side, out from behind this shrapnel, next to the first hatch going down into the hangar deck. Very quickly, they started stripping my gear off, survival gear and all that stuff. And I was carrying a 38 and whatever, with the helmet and all. And Dick Housen, who was a pilot in my squadron, all of a sudden appeared there. So he started taking my flight gear. I've done a number of these stories, but I don't talk about this that much, and I don't know why, except that the guy who carried me down, all the way down to the second deck, so now we're talking a long way for him to carry me. He walked into my brother's music store in Pensacola on Palafox one day, and this was years after this happened. And he said to my brother, I'm the one who saved your brother and got him off the flight deck. And he says, I've been driving by your store for 5 years trying to get up the nerve to come in and talk to you about it. So back to the ship, and we're going down to sick bay, and he got me down there. And I was one of the first arrivals because of this pace of how this all happened. And so I was by myself in a bed, and it started filling up very quickly. And it was god-awful down there very quickly. One of our plane captains came in and put him in a bed across the passageway, not the passageway, the compartment from me. His name was Zwirlin, and really, really nice guy, and he had terrible burns over most of his body. But most of his nerve endings were, I guess, gone, and he was not feeling that much pain, but he was sitting up in bed. And I remember the first person who came down to find me was my roommate, Dick Briner. I grabbed him by his flight suit, I think he was wearing a flight suit, and said, look, this thing may go down, and I want you to come down and find me, but I'm going to be coming up the ladder as best I can, because we may have to get off the ship. He says, I'll be here. Meanwhile, Zwirlin was talking about who lived and who died, and he was asking me, and I had just found out from Dick that Gary and Fred and Denny were deceased, and that hit me very hard. Bearing in mind, I'm just a little Mississippi kid, not the smartest guy around. I was a decent pilot, but this is all new turf for my life, and never been through anything like that. It was hard to assimilate. I remember laying there, Zwirlin's across the way, places filling up, the floors covered in blood, and I find out that those guys had passed away, and I was getting all choked up. Had some tears in my eyes, and it didn't last long, because as I laid there, I realized that my tears were not for Gary and Fred and Denny as much as I knew right away that my tears were because I was not going to have them around. And of course, those tears are selfish tears, I said to myself, because it's my loss. I'm not crying so much that they lost their lives, and this is normal. That's not abnormal. It's just normal stuff. That was an instant growing up moment for me. It was a life lesson. Zwirlin went over to the repose, and he died there because he was burned too bad. We lost 134 people, and I lost my 3 close friends, the only 3 pilots killed during the entire disaster. I won't go through the rest of that. It was just being there, and offloaded in QB, and I went into the hospital there. I just found out recently that at QB Point, one of the people who was in my hospital room was Larry Duthie, who had just he was injured off the Oriskany in a shoot down in which he ejected at over 500 knots, and he was hurt pretty bad. And there's a whole story. He wrote the book, and I just found out recently that he was the guy in my room at the hospital bed next to me in QB in a hospital room for 2 people. So it was a good reunion, and I don't know how he remembered me. He must have taken notes. He had a diary going or something. Makes me feel inferior, but great guy, and we had that experience together, and I've met him since then because he's written some books. Great guy. I stayed in the hospital there until I was evacuated over to Clark Air Force Base, and then stayed at a flight casualty staging center there, full of mostly Korean soldiers that were all torn up. I remember in the bed next to me, there was a young Korean soldier there, and he was in a body cast from the neck all the way down to his ankles. And he had multiple wounds all over the place, and they had cutouts in the wounds so they could tend them in this whole plaster cast that they had his body in. And I remember there was a Korean sergeant there who was liaison, spoke English. And so he came over to me and said that the young kid next to me, the young soldier, had killed 3 VC. Held up his fingers, he had 3 VC, and I look at him next to me on the bed, and he's beaming with pride. And he was so proud that he had done his job. From that flight casualty staging center at Clark, it was C-141 back through Alaska, Anchorage, and then all the way over to Andrews. And then we stayed there at Andrews a night before we were sent down to Portsmouth. I finished my month in captivity in hospitals and such. My unique part about staying in the hospital at Portsmouth was that I was with a retired commander who had been in the Bataan Death March. And this guy was just, I was thrilled to hear the kind of history coming out of his mouth. But at that point, I was feeling great. I didn't think, nobody had told me I could get out of bed, but I don't know where I got my clothes. I think my roommate brought me some civilian clothes, and I had those with me at Portsmouth. And late in the day, I would tell the commander, I'll leave for a while, and I would go across the street to the O Club and have dinner and a couple of beers. And I did that I was there for a week before I finally was seen by an orthopedic surgeon who was the first time a doctor had actually looked at me in the past month, since it all happened. In my medical record, it shows that they splint my arm and they did this and they did that. They put my arm in a cast. None of that was ever done. So there was a lot of gun decking going on there. But before I left the hospital, I stopped by a young man who had been terribly injured the day before the fire. Why did we have the fire? One of the contributing factors was that, like some other online ships and air wings, they were bypassing normal safety procedures for arming weapons before you get it pointed in the right direction for rockets or going anywhere. So they were connecting weapons and the Zunis that were on our airplanes. They were connecting the umbilicals right there in the pack. The pack being the F4s on one side pointed at us A4s. When that rocket went off of the VF-11, I think it was, F4. Jim Bangert, the CAG LSO, was there, and so he escaped from his airplane okay, but the rockets came over, and for years and years and years, it's been said that it was John McCain's airplane whose the rocket hit. Rocket or rockets. I'm not sure if it was one or more. It was the 4-pack. Really, when you look at the JAG report on the accident, which is over 7,000 pages long, it says in there, in McCain's own words, that he was not hit by the rocket. And when you simply look at the report's flight deck diagram and what the supposed direction of everything, they weren't lined up to hit McCain's airplane next to me. It was Fred White's airplane into his 400-gallon centerline drop tank. And that was the whoomp that I heard in the cockpit.
I've been very quiet and benign in my light attack naval career. However, when the safety officer has a stand down and he says, "Naz, would you brief us on your ejection?" And I would say, "Sure, which one?" He would say the one where the engine quit, and I would say, "Sure, which one?" As this crowd knows, the A7 Corsair II, the mighty Corsairs, were from Vietnam all the way to Desert Storm, and in between, the A7 was the backbone of the fleet. If you wanted to send the very best, power projection, or war at sea, the Corsairs were delivering the mail. What I'd like to talk to is the very last missions for the mighty Corsair, and then debrief you on the last flight flying into the Boneyard. I was running around in the Magic Kingdom for Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Desert Recovery up in Kuwait City. It was time to come back to the world. The detailer said, "Do you want to go to China Lake or Point Magoo?" And I said, "I've had my time in the desert. I want to go to the beach." So I rolled into Point Magoo, and as a NavAir job, we had 33 airplanes of 5 different types and 800 people to maintain them. And there were 5 A7s on the ramp. Now, at this point, the fleet is twin-tailed gas guzzlers and F-14s. These were the only A7s that the Navy had that still had a mission. And what we were doing was research development, test, and evaluation. The F-14 was on an 18-month software cycle for upgrades. So we had to validate it, and the turkeys would take off, go onto the sea range. When he was a good system, we'd take an A7 out, and you would fly cards, a profile, so the Rio could do his thing in the back seat. The mighty A7 is now a blip on the radar scope for a Rio. Shucks. But we did have some exciting missions. One of the other things we did were to chase Tomahawks. If a cruiser or destroyer would shoot a Tomahawk, it would go feet dry. We would chase it through its low level, and ended up in the China Lake weapons complex and hit its target. It was a lot of fun to over the ship, see it go off. The most exciting one I had was a subsurface launch from a submarine. Sitting out there in lat long, 10 minutes to launch, 10 seconds to launch. See a lot of white caps down there. Sure hope this works. Sure enough, vessel's launched. I happen to look down to the left, and there out of the water comes a Tomahawk. The shell comes off. The missile takes off for the beach, and we jumped on it and just fly cruise on it for its. We had the in the system for the low levels. If the missile decided to go silly and go to LA or something, the backseater had a box where he could flip a switch to take command of the missile and a joystick to either fly it in the water or fly it into the mountain. So that was basically what the A7 was doing in the end game for the last time. And these were 5 A7s, a mixture of TA7Cs and EA7Ls. Well, consolidation, efficiency, all that good stuff. The aerial target guys with QF4Ns were jumping up and down that they could do our mission and we could get rid of the A7s. So that meant we saved money on a contract maintenance crew, and then the jets went away. So I flew the TA7s to Jacksonville. They went through the depot and were configured for the Hellenic Air Force. Been flagged, and they get foreign military sales to the Greeks, which left us 2 A7 EA7Ls. Now, the A7's gone from the fleet. It was never my style to just fly the last flight for the A7 to go for cross country from Point Mugu to Davis Moth, and that wasn't going to hack it. So I made some phone calls. The two of us got up. My wingman was a lieutenant who was on the Kennedy in the Gulf War, practicing for his interviews for the airlines. He was with me, and we got some pictures of the section takeoff out of Point Mugu. Went out over the water. The VFR entry into Mugu, because we had to be quiet for all the rich houses on the mountain and Camarillo, was more complicated than the home field entry at Southley Field. You can remember that. So I left my wingman out of the water. I came in, flew by, did a flyby the field to the adoring fans, all 12 of them. Now it was time to scoot up to Lemoore, center of the universe. So we checked in with LA Center, headed up that way, checked in with Oakland Center. Now, all the Lemorons that are here know that baritone voice from the Oakland Center controller that looked after us when we went up for PMCF flights at 40,000 feet and did us. So I checked in. Sure enough, it was his voice. And he said, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure. If I don't know the answer, I'll make something up. He said, my strip shows you guys are A7s. We haven't worked those in years. It was so good to work with you guys. Then there was a pause, and he said, anything you want to do, you just tell me and I'll clear you for it. Okay. little devil's horns came up. Back in the day, you know, bad Nas was sitting here. Nas? Then there was good Nas sitting over here that said, Nas, just fly your plan. So, okay, we flew down, rug dance with Skipper Lemoore, so we flew by the White House and the flag. We're going to fly up the right side, just inbound to the taxiway. And I wanted to fly just at 250 knots so we could get a lot of time to come by it. Sure enough, looking down, and there from the hangar, you could just see the troops running out onto the ramp, looking, pointing. What's that smoke-belching dinosaur doing flying by the field? Just a little bit of yug and pulled out because I wanted to get some angle off to come back around and fly down fleet side. Turned back around and, you know, felt the airplane just talking to me on the airframe a little bit. So I AMF on. Be bad form to depart it at that point. But sure enough, came back down the fleet side, and the same thing. Troops came running out of the hangars, looking at it, and away we went. Scooted down, flew by Loom Lobby, El Centro, Chocolate Mountain, Yuma, just for nostalgia's reasons. and got set up to come into Davis-Monthan. If you haven't ever flown in there, it is really spectacular to see American aviation history all lined up. It's really cool. And here we are, bringing them 2 more. So we're coming into I told the tower we're going to do a carrier break. The last time I saw the airspeed needle, it was moving through 350. So we had a little bit of smack on it. Roll, yug, rollers down through the maze, high lift devices down, roll wings level, sure enough, master caution lights flashing. Just, yeah, perfect. and of course, the tack end needle had been spinning for about the last hour. Went to key the mic and the radios were dead. So I said, okay, let's see what master caution light says. And look down at PC2. There's the gauge down there doing a little electrical 0 thing. So this is perfect. No tack end, no radio, PC2, last flight. Yeah. Sure enough, it must have been a bubble in the line because the PC power came. I had hydraulics. Came in, wagged my wings, went back around, squawk 7600. Sir, I saw a green light from the tower. Landed, rolled out, took it back in where they have the area force. We had some of our troops there to chalk it and lock it, disconnect the oxygen, take some of that stuff out. And it was, there's a picture also on the side, sign in the airplane. Nas says, stay cool. There were no marching bands. There were no rockets, red glare. It was the end of an era. The last of the A7s in the boneyard.
My progress, and I joined the squadron back in Jacksonville after I stopped by Airlant to get orders, and I got there a day before Forrestal arrived in Mayport, and I was with the widow of Denny Barton, Laurie Barton, and Gary Stark's fiance. I went with them out to the ship, and they let us walk up and walk the flight deck, and it was kind of a creepy thing for me at that point to see all the temporary battens on down to get the flight deck secure, all done at Cuby Point with big hunks of wood, and so we were all out at Cecil and back. As what was remained of the squadron as far as pilots go. And we were given older model A4Bs to fly for 9 months, waiting on A7 transition. And we did, and the time passed, except during that period of time, I had an engine fail on me in one of those Bravos, and we were coming back from down around the Pinecastle target area. We were not on a weapons flight. We were on a functional flight test flight, myself and my wingman. It was on the weekend, and we were doing several of these. As I added power slightly, just making some normal adjustments, and then I felt the airplane move fore and aft slightly, and it was creepy. I never felt that. But everything looked normal on the gauges. And then I said to Joe, who was flying lead, I said, Joe, do you feel any weird turbulence? And he says, no, smooth as silk. I said, you know, I don't know what this is. And then about that time, a whiff of smoke came through the cabin vents. It was just a whiff. Mostly I just smelled it. And it was gone, boom, come and gone. And I said, Joe, I've got the lead. I'm turning back to Cecil. And so as I did, and I'm starting to rationalize things. And this was my big mistake through this whole evolution. So I said to myself, probably a little piece of oil came down there and got in the air cycle machine for the AC. And that's what I smelled. And then I called up the squadron on the tactical freak, and in the ready room with the SDO for that day was Pete Taylor, still a good friend of mine all these years later. I told him what was going on, that I had these surges, had a little whiff of smoke, but everything seemed normal. He said, why don't you try manual fuel? And so I said, oh, a good idea, I'll try it. That was a mistake, because if I'd left the throttle right where it was and done nothing, I probably would have made it all the way back. But I didn't, because I didn't have enough clues as far as my little pea brain was thinking to tell me, this is serious, you better go land somewhere else in Daytona, or whatever's the closest to land and get this figured out. Or just set the stuck throttle procedure and continue inbound. But I didn't do that, and I did pull the throttle back, so I did an RPM cycle to idle and back twice, because I came back in manual fuel and then back up again. And it all seemed normal, except that as it came up the second time, there was a slight shudder in the airframe. Now that raised my hackle a little bit, but I thought to myself, I must have pushed the throttle a little too early. I had never flown the airplane in manual fuel. So another dismissal on my part. And so I'm leading, so I'm talking, and we switch over to tower, Cecil Tower, and then as we, I started to check in. Before I could say a word, Joe started talking, and he declared an emergency. And I was not happy about that, because I really didn't, at this point, didn't think that I had a serious problem. And I look at it, and he's out there about 10 feet away, and I go, what are you doing? And I'm thinking, I'm hand signals here. But while I look back inside the cockpit at the instrument panel and I could see that the engine temperature is rising. And while I'm trying to figure out what the limits are, I can see that it's rising. It's not creeping slowly. It's actually coming up pretty fast. And I keyed the mic and said, looks like I do have an engine problem to the tower. I may be punching out of this. And shortly after that, it pegged out, smoke, a cockpit filled with smoke, and I decided to use, because of the altitude, I did the right thing and pulled the D-ring instead of the face curtain. Well, what I did wrong, again, was something else I did wrong, is I failed to straighten myself up in the seat, so when I pulled the D handle, I was looking at it. So I had great pain in my upper back when I, not so much felt during the 18G shot, but when I got on the ground, I couldn't move because I got cramped up so bad. And it took a while. I was picked up by a Marine Reserve helicopter just out goofing around and heard that there was a mayday. So the SAR helicopter never made it to me, but I got picked up, took me to Cecil. And so it kept me in a hospital for one night, and that was it. And then shortly after that, we went into A7 transition to check out in the A7Bs. I made that a part of that med cruise, and then I was rift, which confused me. I was part of the USNR group that were rift from the active duty, and I never could figure out how they figured that, because they still needed pilots for Vietnam. I was mystified why it happened. I was happy because I wanted to go out and do this airline thing, and so I did, and I owned the med cruise. I was let go, and I was made via the COD to Italy, and then found my way through C-130, and then a charter out of Spain back to the States, and then I was relieved from active duty. What I did after that was to join the reserves in Jacksonville. That was in '69. And I had recently joined airline flying, but then I was with National Airlines, strikes every time you turned around. Labor was terrible, relationship was terrible. And you're right, and I was the bottom guy on the seniority list, so I had great incentive to race up to NAS Jacks and go to the Navy Reserves there, and I joined to fly A4s there. So I'm starting over in A4s. We later transitioned to A7As, which is why I've got my experience about pull the flaps up and stall. So I flew, we flew the A's for just 2 or 3 years, and they were quickly replaced by the same A7Bs that I'd flown in VA-46. Same airplanes. They still had a new smell almost. That was a good transition, and it's a few years later, and I'm back in the Corsair, and I wound up flying most of my time in the Corsair, and I stayed in VA 203 until XOCO, and my change of command, and then I no longer was flying at all, and so that put me flying in the Navy straight through for 18 and a half years.